It is with great pleasure that I welcome Reverend Scott Simpson today. To most here, he requires no introduction. For any that may not know Scott, he is our Associate Pastor of Congressional Care. He cares and nourishes the congregation through guidance, support, and training. Scott oversees the deacons and Stephen ministers. He is truly a Texan. He grew up in Texas. He graduated from Texas Tech. He received his Master of Divinity at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He and Suzanne have 3 sons, one of whom I think most of you know if you come regularly, Sam, who is responsible for taping our meetings every month, which we really appreciate. Without further ado, Scott, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Rick. Sam's other brothers are Zach, if you don't know his name. Zach is newly employed at the San Antonio Botanical Gardens.
Okay.
He's on the gardener staff. There's like 25 gardeners there, so Zach's a horticulture entomology major from you know where. Where's Charlie at? Oh, there he is. You know where, Texas A&M.
Yeah.
Which is where Sam graduated from school. Little brother Josh is a junior biochemistry major at the University of Texas at Austin. So he's in I think the end of finals, and then Thursday I'm driving up to his apartment to move him to another apartment inside the apartment complex. This is all the management they're moving, so we've got 3 hours to move his entire apartment to the new apartment.
Wow.
I'm going to bring some money and pay somebody off for it. I don't like to rush when we move, so. It's so nice to be here today. I'm very flattered to be asked to, I think Shelley was the one who asked me originally to read The Leopard is Loose. As those of you who know me, I have a knack for procrastination. I'm a professional procrastinator, but fortunately I'm married to somebody who reads all the time. And Susie loaned me one of her Kindles, so I didn't get my hands on the book, paper-wise. I used her Kindle, and this is how I just wanted you to see it. This is how I read the book on this Kindle. Quick read, those of you who read it. It wasn't a very long read, a very easy read. So here it goes. This is what I came up with. When it comes to children, perception becomes reality. What is a good definition of perception? Perception is the information that your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren receive through their senses. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. His or her reality is how he or she understands that information at that given time in the world and believes it to be true. That perception becomes reality for your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren may sound a little like hyperbole, but in his book, The Leopard is Loose, Stephen Harrigan, the author, finds what I think is a great angle, a shrewd angle, if you will, that I think justifies his claim. Writing this intimate story through the eyes of a 5-year-old boy, Grady McClarty, Grady's perception of his adult world around him was his reality. And it opened his eyes wide. And he learned a lot about his world around him and himself. So for purposes of this book review, I will review the following areas: setting and characters, then author and plot, and then one recommendation. First, the setting and characters. The setting was Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in the summer of 1952. Grady and his family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on Northwest 34th Street, which, by the way, is, at least according to the book, is only 7 blocks north of where Susie's mother, Gail Gladstein, currently lives in Oklahoma City, just off of May Avenue. So Susie's very familiar with Oklahoma City. Her mother remembers when the Leopard became loose. It was funny, she became animated when, Susie and I reminded her of that event, and she said, "Oh yeah, that was a big mess." That's how she described it. Grady and his family's apartment backed up to a sprawling public park, which was likely Memorial Park, according to Susie. In front of the house, across a small patch of fenced yard, was the 2-story prairie-style house where Grady's grandparents and his Aunt Vivian lived. And above Grady and his family lived Grady's 2 uncles in a garage apartment. Grady's grandparents built their house sometime before World War I, that is, before 1914. The addition above Grady's apartment and the bachelor apartment above it was at least 30 years newer. Grady's grandfather built the addition soon after the end of the World War II, which was about 1945, so that after the war, Grady and his brother and his mother could have a place to live when they arrived home in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, Oklahoma was also the location of the Great Leopard escape. A leopard named Leapy in the book, you remember that name? According to Grady, leaped out of his pit at the Oklahoma City, the Lincoln Park Zoo, and escaped in this city, and as we read in the book, caused all kinds of excitement, chaos, and fear. Grady's family consisted of his mother, Bethy McClarty, because, quote, there were so many people in our household who called her that, end quote, so that the words mother, quote, or mom never really was used. According to Grady, Bethy was protective, loving, responsible, and sometimes a little stern. In 1952, according to Grady, his mother would have been 32. Bethy was a former Army nurse with the rank of lieutenant in the war and now was employed in Oklahoma City as a nurse at St. Anthony's Hospital. Bethy was pregnant with Grady when her husband died, and as a result, Bethy did what a lot of widowed spouses did after World War II. They moved back home. Next came Grady's older brother, Danny, older by a year, whom Grady still thought of as his protector. Even more, Grady thought Danny was fearless and courageous. Remember the part of the book where Grady tells about he and Danny climbing the fountain, and that's where a lot of fearless and courageous was. Then there was the late Captain Bert McClarty, Bethy's husband and Grady and Danny's father, a former fighter pilot in the war who tragically died in a peacetime war accident, a test flight. Grady's extended family consisted of his father Daniel, lovingly referred to as Big Dan. As described by Grady, Dan was, quote, a little under 6 feet, and though he was sedentary and a bit overweight, you wouldn't have thought of him as big in the sense of taking up a lot of space. But to Grady and Danny, Big Dan was as towering and stolid as the Biltmore Hotel downtown. Big Dan, according to Grady, was steady and shared a sense of humor that was almost shy. But it was Big Dan's steadiness that was Grady's anchor for his childhood security. Big Dan was general manager of a Chevrolet dealership called Chickasha Chevrolet, or AKA The Place. Grady and Danny loved to go to The Place with Big Dan and enjoy going out to lunch with their grandfather at a local restaurant, have a sandwich at the counter, and especially hang out in his office. Big Dan was an anchor for the entire family. In addition, there was Grady's grandmother, known as Babby, a diminutive of, you Czech folks, correct me, Babby Kaka, is that close? It's a Czech word for grandmother. Babby and Big Dan went to high school together and married at the tender age of 19. A wonderful Czech cook, Babby was famous for her, quote, her noodle soup and goulash and kolaches and fried chicken. Are you hungry now? Grady remembers Babby as energetic, way more energetic than Big Dan. Babby was always rushing out of the house to a book club meeting, an altar society or something like that, and Grady observed this high metabolism as likely part of an unconscious strategy to keep her thoughts at bay, to keep her worries and her memories from catching up with her. Among them was the death of her young daughter, Mary Helen. Next in the family was Grady's two uncles, Frank and Emmett. Frank was Bethy's older brother by a year. Grady remembers Frank as, quote, always a quiet adult present, so still and composed that his slightest movement drew your attention. He was taller than Emmett and stood straighter. He kept his brown hair short and tightly combed. He had been an infantry sergeant in the war, in World War II. He had a natural presumption of being in charge, in command. But sometimes, according to Grady, it was frightening to see how Uncle Frank's composure could disappear suddenly without warning. Which explains why Grady wondered how the war changed his Uncle Frank, how it caused him to lose his temper so quickly and to often drink when the pain appeared. I'll say a little more about Uncle Frank toward the end of the book review. On the other hand, there was Uncle Emmett. Uncle Emmett was younger, much younger. Probably in his mid to late 20s, like Frank. Uncle Emmett served in the war. He was a veteran of the Italian campaign in World War II. Emmett, like other veterans, never talked much about the war, but Grady learned that Uncle Emmett likely participated in an assault on a river called the Rapido River, where the men of his division, that's the 36th Division, were ordered to cross that river in the winter of 1944. So you knew it was cold. The attack was an attempt to break through the Germans' lines that blocked the Allied advance into Rome, but it was also a suicide mission. And Uncle Emmett, along with the rest of the division, faced the Germans' mortar shells and machine guns. Grady wasn't sure, but it was likely that Emmett made it across the river, but at a huge cost, emotionally and mentally. Uncle Emmett, Grady remembers, was awakened often by bad dreams where he would shake, scream, and cry out loud. Like Uncle Frank, Emmett would often drink with his brother, even though Uncle Emmett carried this burden from the war. Grady remembered him as fretful, caring, protective, and lots of fun. Another member of Grady's extended family was Vivian, his and Danny's aunt. Vivian was, quote, young and untethered and unbothered, always delighted by the prospect of something unexpected and semi-forbidden. I love that description, don't you? Grady remembers that Aunt Vivian was a source of comfort in his childhood. For example, Aunt Vivian loved to read stories to Grady and Danny before bedtime, but was known to change her mind and shift directions and read Blondie from the funny papers. You remember Blondie. Grady remembers Vivian as lighthearted and fun. Vivian loved to wear nice clothes and hats and shoes and lots of perfume. You knew she was about to come into her room before you even saw her. And Vivian worked as a secretary to the vice president of an oil and gas company. And later that changed for Vivian, as you remember at the end of the book. Lastly, there was Hugh. Hugh was the friend of a man Vivian was dating. Hugh was unmarried, devout, Catholic, loved his mother. That's a deadly combination. Catholic and loving your mother. It's an attractive one, too. Confident, handsome, well-dressed, who eventually met Bethy thanks to Vivian and would marry Bethy and become Grady and Danny's new father. Second, the author and the plot. So there's a lot of characters in this story, in this historical fiction novel. Stephen Harrigan, the author, who you probably learned lives in Austin, was requested by Marguerite Talking Thunder of the Oklahoma City Historical Society to, quote, record an oral history of the Great Leopard escape that happened in Oklahoma City in 1950. Instead of recording an oral history, Harrigan set out to provide a written one based on his childhood memories that looked not only at his past, but, quote, trying to sort out who everybody was back then and what they were thinking and how I came to be who I am, end quote. The author remembers that McClarty's lived with the Brennans and in a quote, a kind of family compound, end quote. And that's really the focus of the story. The Leopard is Loose. It's also what mostly happened in real life to Stephen Harrigan, who was born to a widowed mother in Oklahoma City in 1948. However, in his opening note to his readers, while he has, quote, set this novel to some degree within the matrix of his own extended family, end quote, it also, quote, is very much a fictional enterprise, end quote, with some historical details altered and key characters created to add a dramatic feel and experience. A leopard actually did escape the Oklahoma City Lincoln Park Zoo in 1950 and created lots of fear and excitement for residents. It also inspired a small band of volunteers, wannabe gun-wielding leopard hunters. I think in the book, Harrigan, through Grady's eyes, remembers 3,000. I remember a 3,000 number, or 30,000. It might have grown more as the story was told. As the author, Harrigan makes brilliant use of this absolutely amazing news event as sort of a trampoline for his novel to begin. As such, Harrigan tweaks the time of the event up a couple of years to the summer of 1952 so that Grady can be old enough, or considered old enough, to remember. So that would make him 5, to remember his fear and terror of this wild man-killing leopard on the loose. Harrigan writes, quote, you'll have to take that into account when judging the accuracy of these recollections. Ellipsis, you should, for instance, treat the conversations that I recount here in quotation marks as only an earnest effort to approximate what might have actually been said. It's up to you to decide whether any of this can be thought of as history and not merely fiction, but I wanted you to know it's as conscientious an effort I can make with fragments of memory to me. I was just a young boy, I wasn't taking notes. Even though Harrigan was asked to tell the story about a leopard loose in Oklahoma City in 1950, this book is truly, I think, about another story. The story of the McClartys and the Brennans and their journey toward a changing point in their family life, a critical changing point in their life. One strength of Harrigan's writing as an author is this skillful way of using the power of perception and deciphering information in his world, in Grady's world, that included place and time through sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Grady's perception of the world around him was his reality, and perhaps more importantly, Grady perceives more than his family realizes throughout the story, even though much of what Grady perceives is really mystery to him and his older brother, Danny. For example, Harrigan aptly describes how Grady was surrounded by a family that built literally a fortress around him to protect him and his brother after they returned home from the war. A fortress whose goal was to protect them from the world, from this loose leopard and any other scary monsters in the world. In addition, Grady understood how growing up in the Catholic Church was also a strong foundation, even though he had to wear the, quote, itchy wool suits and endure unintelligible Latin masses. Because going to Mass every Sunday was mandatory in Grady's family. For Grady, his family, and going to church was, quote, a little world I inhabited that seemed so orderly and peaceful, end quote, before that leopard escaped. Harrigan writes, quote, I suppose that security was part of an illusion, a spell that all the adults actively worked to create and maintain for the two fatherless boys who landed in their midst. They intended to start the world anew with us, to keep us innocent of the war that in some sense had created us and made us half orphans. End quote. Once the leopard escaped the zoo, unexpected and exciting new experiences penetrated the sanctity and security of Grady's world. Perception became reality for Grady. Now I'm going to go through quickly a number of experiences. Brief description. First, Grady tells of seeing, quote, something terrifying lying on the floor in the middle of his apartment in a hallway, not completely dark, a black, shapeless, menacing entity, end quote, which turned out to be a raincoat. A raincoat monster lying on the floor that created much fear and terror for Grady. We're going to come back to that raincoat monster in just a little while. Second, the request of seeing the occurrence of a spectacular passing comet at the behest of Uncle Frank and Emmett, quote, pounding on their door at who knows what time in the evening or early morning, waking them up. Third, Grady encountering a segregationist bullying a young black girl with his words at a counter of a local restaurant with Danny and Big Dan watching, and them enjoying lunch. Grady remembers Big Dan stopping the bullying with one powerful word, hey! That's me imagining how loud Big Dan said, hey. I wasn't yelling at you. Fourth, suddenly meeting Hugh at the park near his home while his family was enjoying a concert together. This came out of the blue for Grady. Grady learns all that he can about Hugh, as previously mentioned, but senses there's something different about Hugh. He senses a potential that he could change his world that he was born into and so familiar with. Ultimately, Grady learns that Hugh lives and works in Midland, Texas, and wonders and even asks Hugh at least once, maybe twice, are you planning to marry my mother? Fifth, seeing and hearing Bethy holding her brother Emmett in her arms one night while he was shaking profusely with sweat pouring down his forehead, learning that Uncle Emmett and Frank, his mother, his father, and others were in a war, World War II. Harrigan writes, quote, the war. People kept talking about it or trying not to talk about it. Once again, I had the image in my head, my mind, of the dark smudge that hovered in the time before I was born and that somehow had marked all the adults I knew. End quote. Sixth, seeing and hearing his Uncle Frank and Big Dan get into a conflict about a black employee of the Chevrolet dealership named Jerome that Big Dan respected, but Uncle Frank apparently did not. Eventually, and unfortunately, this disagreement caused Big Dan to have to fire his son, Frank, from working at the place. Ultimately, the disagreement damaged Frank's relationship with his dad, Big Dan. Seventh, witnessing Uncle Frank talk to Hugh and even push Hugh in a disrespectful way in the grandparents' home. Eighth, learning that Bethy, upon the persuasion of Uncle Frank, would allow Uncle Frank and Emmett to take her boys out of the house after, this is when the leopard is loose. And, here's the need to protect the fortresses in place. But there's this sense that maybe Bethy had with her brothers that, I trust them and hope that they'll, things will turn out and they'll stay out of trouble. But trouble followed them quickly. And the trouble was that both Grady and his brother had to witness Frank and Emmett get into a fight with the black family that eventually became a riot because Emmett accidentally shot their dog, believing it looked like the man-eating leopard on the loose while they were hunting for the leopard, despite Big Dan's disapproval. Grady learned that civil injustice begins with harsh words and eventually leads to violence. And Grady also learned, thanks to his mother Bethy, under a bed, that he does have courage inside himself to face his fears. Ninth, Grady learned that Bethy and Hugh did love him and wanted to protect him and his brother, and came and rescued them from the riot while watching their uncles. That's the men in their lives who were serving as their fathers be arrested and taken away to jail. 10th, Grady and his family somehow came upon the leopard on the loose who was dying because it had consumed horse meat tainted with a drug to put it to sleep so that it could be returned to the zoo. But unfortunately, that horse meat was tainted with too much drug. And the leopard, which mostly looked like now an emaciated domesticated cat, really wasn't that scary to Grady and his family. The death of that leopard, I think, represented the death of Grady's innocence. And think about it. Grady lost his innocence watching all that violence. And probably some other scenes. And when that leopard died, that was a sign for Grady saw that leopard wasn't a scary monster as the news made it out to be. Now I'm going to take you back. Do you remember the raincoat monster? I stopped and I had to read that a few times because I thought he's really being descriptive here, about fear. And something else is going on here. And I think that monster, that raincoat monster, represented the real monster that was already loose in the family. That's the same family who wanted to shield Grady and his brother not only from the leopard, but from the dangerous world. More specifically, the monster lived inside his Uncle Frank and Emmett. As Grady learned, the two uncles who loved both boys with all their heart, who became like fathers for two fatherless boys, but unfortunately were damaged, hurt by PTSD from the war. Perception became reality for Grady. Grady's eyes were opened wide by the reality of the world. And one of the things Grady learned, besides a lot about himself and about the world post-World War II, what Oklahoma City was really like, what home was like, was safety and security is truly an illusion. Ultimately, the critical point in the comfortable Brennan-McClarty family arrived, and Grady is absolutely powerless to stop the decisions that adults in his life will make that will eventually become his new reality, his new world. And so Bethy and Hugh were married, just as he perceived. And together with Grady and Danny, they moved to Midland. They crossed that Red River like Sam and our family have crossed so many times to go and visit. Susie's mom crossed the river, as I always put it, to enter a new reality, to enter a new world together as a new family that I think Grady always hoped and dreamed was always possible. Finally, a recommendation, and that is, if you haven't read this book yet, I encourage you to read it at your earliest convenience. It is true that it is a story of heartbreak and joy. I had a hard time, I don't know about you, but I had a hard time reading that last chapter. It was emotional. Whoa. It just seemed like this story just crescendoed. I like to use music metaphors. It just crescendoed. Tom would say, yeah, that's probably about right. Fortissimo. It just got louder, more, just dominated. It got bigger and bigger and stronger. Yeah, it's a story of heartbreak and joy, but it's also a story, it's our story too. One more thing I learned from reading this grand book I thoroughly enjoyed reading. I think we often make the mistake of assuming that children will interpret messages or information in the world in the same manner or way as adults do. That's just not true. That's absolutely wrong. For Stephen Harrigan, this story, not the one about the loose leopard, is the one his heart really needed to share. did. I hope you are too. Thanks for inviting me to read this book, and